Here is a letter that was 67 words long. Not 67 pages. Not a treaty. 67 words, roughly the length of a text message, dashed off by a British official in the autumn of 1917. And those 67 words helped set the borders, the wars, and the grievances of the Middle East for the next 100 years. But here is the part nobody tells you. That letter was not written by an empire flexing its muscle. It was written by an empire that was almost broke. An empire that had run out of gold, run out of credit, and was weeks away from being unable to pay for the biggest war in human history. And when a great power runs out of money, it does something dangerous. It starts promising things it does not own to anyone who can keep it alive. That is what this letter was. Not a gift, not a grand moral vision, a promise made in desperation about land Britain did not yet control to people whose futures were about to collide. So forget what you think you know about the Balfour Declaration. Because once you follow the money, once you trace the debts and the loans and the panic inside the British Treasury, the whole story changes shape. Let me show you. To understand why Britain made that promise, you have to understand how close it came to losing everything. In August of 1914, when the war began, almost nobody expected it to last. The soldiers who marched off that summer were told they would be home by Christmas. The generals believed it. The bankers believed it. Every treasury in Europe had planned for a short, sharp campaign, the kind of war that ended in a few decisive battles and a signed agreement. Instead, the armies dug into the ground and stopped moving. The trenches stretched from the coast of Belgium all the way to Switzerland, and the war turned into something no government on earth had budgeted for. It became a machine that ate money at a speed nobody had ever seen. Think about what modern industrial war actually costs. You have millions of men who need to be fed every single day, clothed, housed, moved by rail and ship across entire continents. You have factories running around the clock, turning out rifles and machine guns and artillery pieces, and you have shells, endless rivers of shells, being fired in quantities that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. A single day of heavy bombardment could consume what an entire pre-war factory produced in a month. All of that has to be paid for, and it has to be paid for now, in cash, in credit, in gold. Before the war, Britain was in an enviable position. Its national debt was modest by the standards of what was coming, and for nearly a century, that debt had been shrinking relative to the size of the economy. The pound sterling was the money the whole world trusted. London was the beating heart of global finance. When a country anywhere on earth needed to borrow, it came to London. Britain sat at the very center of the gold standard, the system that underpinned international trade, and it sat there like it owned the place, because in many ways it did. This was the richest, most creditworthy nation on the planet. But creditworthiness is a strange thing. It can take 100 years to build and 2 years to burn. By 1916, just 2 years into the fighting, Britain's national debt had exploded past £2 billion and was still climbing fast. The government raised enormous sums by selling war bonds to its own citizens, hundreds of millions of pounds, patriotic loans marketed as a duty, and even that was not enough. On top of the long-term borrowing there was a mountain of short-term debt, treasury bills that had to be constantly rolled over. The interest payments alone were becoming a crisis inside the crisis. The Chancellor of the Exchequer admitted something remarkable to Parliament, that new taxes could cover the interest on the new borrowing, but not the borrowing itself. Read that carefully. Britain was no longer paying for the war. It was paying the interest on the war and pushing the actual bill onto some future generation that had not been born yet. And here is where it gets worse. Because Britain was not only funding its own war, it had become the banker for the entire alliance. France, Russia, Italy, and a handful of smaller partners could not fully pay for their own campaigns. So London funneled money and credit and supplies to all of them. Britain was the clearinghouse of the Allied war effort, the account that everything ran through. France's finances were in ruins. Russia was sliding toward revolution, and every one of those bills eventually landed on the British Treasury, which had to find the money somewhere. There was only one place left to find it: across the Atlantic. In the United States. Now we come to the center of the whole story, and it is not a battlefield, it is a bank. When the war broke out, the most powerful financial house in America was J.P. Morgan and Company, and Morgan had a long relationship with the British government. When the fighting started, that relationship deepened into something enormous. Morgan became the purchasing agent for Britain and France in the United States. That meant that virtually everything the Allies bought on American soil, the rifles, the shells, the steel, the grain, the cotton, the horses, all of it passed through Morgan's hands. Over the course of a couple of years, Morgan arranged the purchase of billions of dollars worth of goods for the Allies. It floated giant bond issues on Wall Street to raise the cash. It arranged the credit lines. It shipped the gold. Morgan became so tangled up in Britain's survival that a leading historian later put it bluntly that by the start of 1917, Morgan was so deeply committed to Britain that when America finally joined the war, it was Morgan being rescued as much as Britain. And then, in late 1916, the ground shifted under everyone's feet. Britain's overdraft with Morgan had swollen to something like $400 million, an almost unimaginable figure, and President Woodrow Wilson made a move that nearly ended the Allied war effort in a single stroke. Wilson was still officially neutral. He was trying sincerely to position himself as the man who could broker peace, and he was uneasy about how deeply American money was now entangled with one side of the war. So he had the Federal Reserve Board issue a warning to American banks and investors. The message was cold and direct. Be careful about lending to foreign governments. Be careful about buying their securities. In effect, tighten the tap that was keeping London and Paris alive. The timing could not have been worse for Britain. Morgan had been preparing an enormous new bond issue, a joint Anglo-French loan, the biggest of the entire war, meant to fund the great military offensives planned for 1917. Wilson's intervention hit Wall Street like a shockwave. Investors got nervous. The private American money that had sustained the Allies for 2 years suddenly looked like it might dry up. And behind closed doors in London, Treasury officials sat down and did the terrifying arithmetic. They calculated how long Britain could survive without American financing. The answer was measured in months, not years. Their internal review concluded that if the American money stopped, Britain would burn through its remaining gold and foreign securities by the middle of 1917, and they had already been scraping the barrel. To keep the dollars flowing, Britain had been selling off everything it could reach. It liquidated American railroad shares. It sold insurance holdings. It even reached into the foreign investments of private British citizens, requisitioning their American securities to raise hard currency. This was a country turning out its own pockets to fund one more year of war. And it still was not enough. France's credit was already exhausted. Russia was collapsing into chaos. Italy was barely holding together. Britain was the last financial pillar of the whole Allied cause, and that pillar was cracking. A single bad week of disrupted credit could have brought the entire war crashing down, not with a battlefield defeat, but with an empty bank account. Because when a nation cannot pay for its war, the war ends, and it usually ends on the enemy's terms. Now picture the mood inside the British War Cabinet in early 1917. On the Western Front, the news is catastrophic. The Battle of the Somme has just ground to a halt, over 1 million men dead or wounded on all sides, and almost nothing gained. In the East, Russia is dissolving into revolution, which everyone understands means Germany will soon be able to move its entire Eastern Army west and hurl it at the Allied lines. The French army is exhausted, and in places, on the edge of mutiny, and the Treasury is quietly telling the leadership that the money is running out. Into this pressure cooker steps a new Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. He has just replaced a predecessor who leaned toward a negotiated settlement. Lloyd George is a different kind of leader entirely. He is restless, aggressive, willing to gamble, willing to strike deals that more cautious men would never touch, and one of the deals now taking shape is with the Zionist movement. To understand why that mattered, you have to see the Zionist movement as it actually was in 1917, not as a fringe idea, but as an organized international political cause, with real leaders, real supporters, and real connections into the corridors of European and American power. Its leaders had been quietly building relationships with British politicians for years, and in 1917, British strategists convinced themselves that this movement could help them with two problems that were keeping them awake at night. The first problem was America. Wilson's neutrality was strangling the Allied cause. Britain needed the United States in the war, and needed it soon. Now, part of the calculation British officials made rested on an assumption about Jewish communities in America, a belief that they held significant sway over public opinion and could help swing the country toward intervention. It is worth pausing here to be honest about this. That belief said as much about the men making it as about reality. It was a stereotype about Jewish influence, one that overstated a unified political power that did not really exist in the way they imagined. But whether or not it was accurate, British leaders acted on it. They thought a public gesture of support for a Jewish homeland might tilt American opinion their way. The second problem was Russia. The revolution there was gathering speed, and the new radical factions were demanding an immediate exit from the war. If Russia dropped out, Germany would be free to turn its full weight on the West. British officials, again working partly from stereotype, hoped that a friendly gesture toward Zionism might generate goodwill among Russian Jews and help keep Russia fighting a little longer. Neither of these calculations was really about the people of Palestine or about the deep ethics of the matter. They were the desperate strategic bets of an empire trying to stay in the game. But the connection between British power and this cause went back much further than the war. And to see it, you have to look at one family whose name would end up on the letter itself. The Rothschilds. For generations, the Rothschild banking dynasty had been intertwined with the British state, and there is one story that captures the relationship perfectly. In 1875, the ruler of Egypt found himself drowning in debt and needed to sell his shares in the Suez Canal Company. The Suez Canal was not just a waterway, it was the artery of the British Empire, the shortcut that connected Britain to India, to its Asian colonies, to the wealth that made it a superpower. Whoever controlled that canal controlled the lifeline of empire. When the chance came to buy those shares, the British Prime Minister wanted to move fast, before rival powers could react. But Parliament was not sitting, and there was no time for a formal vote to release government funds. So the Prime Minister turned to the Rothschilds. According to the family's own archive, when the banker asked what security the government could offer for such an enormous loan, the answer that came back was, in effect, the British government itself. The money was advanced on trust, the shares were bought, and Britain became the largest single shareholder in the most strategically vital waterway on Earth, financed by a private bank on little more than a handshake. That one episode tells you almost everything about the relationship. It was not a partnership of equals. It was the relationship between a borrower and a lender, between a government that needed cash and a bank that had it. And the Rothschilds had a second connection to Palestine that long predated the war. One member of the French branch of the family, Baron Edmond de Rothschild, had spent decades funding Jewish agricultural settlements in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. When waves of Jewish refugees fled violent pogroms in the Russian Empire in the early 1880s, the Baron poured his private fortune into buying land, building settlements, sending agricultural experts to teach farming, and financing the infrastructure to keep those colonies alive. He funded some of the earliest and best-known settlements, sank an enormous personal fortune into the effort over his lifetime, and bought up a substantial acreage of land. In Israel to this day, he is remembered simply as the Baron. So when a British Foreign Secretary sat down in 1917 to write a letter expressing support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, and chose to address it to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leading figure in British Zionism and a member of that same dynasty, it was not a random choice. The letter went to the family that had financed both the British Empire and Jewish settlement in Palestine, the family whose money had bought Britain the Suez Canal. This is the moment the story gets uncomfortable. And it is also the moment we have to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of history that gets twisted into something ugly. So let me be precise. The temptation is to draw a straight line and say that a single banking family secretly pulled the strings and engineered the whole thing for its own ends. That is not what the evidence shows, and it is worth saying plainly, because that story, the story of a shadowy family controlling nations from behind the curtain, is an old and poisonous myth, and it is false. What the real evidence shows is messier and, honestly, more interesting. It shows an empire in crisis, pulled by many hands and many motives at once. Money being one of them, but only one. To see how many hands were on this, you have to meet a man whose role in the story is almost too strange to believe, and it has nothing to do with banking. His name was Chaim Weizmann, and he was a chemist. Born in the Russian Empire, he moved to England in the early 1900s and became a lecturer in biochemistry at the University of Manchester. He was brilliant, magnetic, and a passionate believer in the Zionist cause. And in 1915, his two great obsessions, chemistry and Zionism, collided in a way that changed history. Britain had a very specific and very dangerous problem. Its entire war effort depended on a smokeless propellant called cordite, the substance packed into virtually every bullet and every artillery shell the British fired. And cordite required a solvent called acetone. The trouble was that Britain's usual method of producing acetone relied on distilling wood, and the forests that supplied that wood were now on the wrong side of the front lines, in enemy hands. So the supply had been choked off. No acetone meant no cordite meant no shells and no bullets. An empire with the largest navy in the world could suddenly find its guns falling silent, not because it ran out of steel, but because it ran out of a chemical. Weizmann had been working, almost by accident, on exactly the process that could save them. He had been experimenting with a bacterium that could ferment ordinary starch, from corn or potatoes into acetone and other useful chemicals. He had actually been trying to make synthetic rubber, and the rubber experiments had failed, but the acetone that came out as a byproduct turned out to be precisely what the British war machine needed. Through a well-connected friend, Weizmann was introduced to Lloyd George, who at that point was the minister in charge of munitions and was frantic about the acetone shortage. Weizmann demonstrated that his fermentation process could produce acetone on an industrial scale. Within months, the government took over British distilleries and converted them to run his process. New factories were built. Together, they turned out tens of thousands of gallons of acetone a year. And over the course of the war, the British Army and Navy fired hundreds of millions of shells, with Weizmann's chemistry as a critical ingredient in a great many of them. Think about what that did for him. It gave a chemistry lecturer with strong political opinions something no amount of lobbying could ever have bought. It gave him direct personal access to the most powerful men in Britain. He was no longer an outsider making arguments. He was the man who had solved one of the most urgent supply crises of the war. And when Lloyd George became Prime Minister at the end of 1916, Weizmann had a direct line into the highest office in the land, at the precise moment when Britain was deciding the future of the Middle East. There is a famous story, often repeated, that when a British statesman asked Weizmann what reward he wanted for his services, he answered that he wanted only one thing: a national home for his people. Historians argue about the exact words, and Lloyd George himself later tried to frame the whole declaration as a personal thank you for Weizmann's chemistry, which is almost certainly too simple. But what nobody disputes is that Weizmann's contribution to the war gave him extraordinary influence at exactly the right time. This was not a banking conspiracy. This was a scientist who made himself indispensable and then used that leverage for a cause he believed in. Now here is where the true recklessness of the whole affair becomes clear, because the promise to the Zionists was not the only promise Britain made about this land. It was the third in a series of commitments that directly contradicted one another, and that contradiction would poison the region for generations. The first promise had come back in 1915 in a series of letters between the top British official in Egypt and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, one of the most important figures in the Arab world and the guardian of Islam's holiest cities. Britain needed the Arabs to rise up against their Ottoman rulers, to open a revolt that would drain Ottoman strength and weaken the enemy from the inside. In exchange, Britain promised its support for an independent Arab state after the war. The exact borders of that state were left deliberately, conveniently vague, but Hussein understood the promise to include Palestine. On the strength of that understanding, the Arab revolt broke out in 1916, and Arab fighters, aided by a young British officer who would become legendary, fought and bled alongside the British in a campaign that helped shatter Ottoman control of the region. They were fighting for a freedom they had been promised. But even while those letters were being written, even while Arab soldiers were dying for that promise, Britain was making a second secret deal that flatly contradicted the first. In 1916, a British diplomat and a French diplomat quietly negotiated an agreement to carve up the Ottoman Empire between their two countries after the war. Under this secret arrangement, France would take control of what is now Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take what is now Iraq and Jordan. And Palestine, the very land Hussein believed had been promised to the Arabs, was to be placed under some vague international administration. This deal was kept hidden from the Arabs. British officials knew about it, agreed among themselves not to reveal it, and let Hussein launch his revolt anyway, fighting for a homeland that had, in secret, already been bargained away. And then came the third promise, on the 2nd of November 1917, in that 67-word letter to Lord Rothschild. The heart of it said that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use its best efforts to help achieve it, with the crucial condition that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Stop and sit with that last phrase. The existing non-Jewish communities. At that time, the land was home to somewhere around 700,000 Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, families who had lived there for many generations alongside a much smaller Jewish population, and the overwhelming majority of the people actually living in that land were not named. They were not called Palestinians, not called Arabs, not called by any identity of their own. They were folded into a single dismissive phrase, defined only by what they were not. Hundreds of thousands of people reduced to a footnote in a subordinate clause. So look at what Britain had done. 3 promises to 3 different groups about one piece of land. The Arabs were promised independence. The French were promised a share of the spoils. The Zionist movement was promised a national home. Not one of these promises could be honored fully without breaking the others. And the people who actually lived in Palestine were consulted about none of it. The contradictions were not some accident, some clerical error. They were the natural product of imperial statecraft at its most desperate and cynical. Britain made promises it could not keep because it was too frightened for its own survival to worry about keeping them. It needed the Arab revolt to weaken the Ottomans. It needed French cooperation to hold the alliance together. And it needed Zionist support, hoped for financial goodwill and political influence, to help keep its war effort funded and to help pull America into the fight. Lloyd George later, in his own memoirs, listed his reasons for backing Zionism, and the list is revealing precisely because it is such a tangle. He mentioned a hope of attracting Jewish financial resources. He mentioned Christian sympathies, the deep emotional attachment that many British Protestants felt to the idea of Jews returning to the Holy Land, an attachment rooted in their reading of the Bible. He mentioned domestic political pressure. He mentioned genuine sympathy for a people facing brutal persecution across Europe. Conviction, calculation, and opportunism, all mixed together. That is the cocktail empires brew when their backs are against the wall. And we should be clear about what this letter actually was, in legal terms, because it is easy to imagine it as some binding grant of territory, It was nothing of the sort. It was a letter from a foreign secretary to a private citizen. It carried no legal force. Britain did not even own Palestine when it was written. The Ottoman Empire still did. British forces had not yet conquered it. The British general would not march into Jerusalem until December of 1917. More than a month after the letter was sent, a victory Lloyd George cheerfully described as a Christmas present for the nation. But the gift he wanted to give had already, on paper, been promised to someone else. The declaration only took on the appearance of legal weight later, when the League of Nations folded it into the terms of the British Mandate over Palestine in the early 1920s. Under that mandate, Britain was supposed to guide Palestine toward eventual independence. It never did. Instead, the mandate became the framework through which Jewish immigration was facilitated on a large scale, steadily transforming the makeup of a land whose population had been overwhelmingly Arab for centuries. Over the following decades, waves of Jewish immigrants arrived, many of them fleeing horrific persecution in Europe, persecution that would soon culminate in the greatest crime of the 20th century. Some came within British quotas, others came in defiance of them, smuggled ashore on ships that ran the mandatory government's blockade. In the space of roughly 30 years, the Jewish population of Palestine grew roughly tenfold. The Arab population grew too, but almost entirely through natural increase rather than immigration. They remained the majority, but the balance was shifting fast, and the tension between the two communities was becoming impossible to contain. Both peoples had been made promises. Both felt, with justice, that Britain had betrayed them. And Britain, caught between two populations to whom it had guaranteed incompatible futures, eventually simply gave up. In 1947, it handed the whole tangled problem to the newly formed United Nations, which proposed dividing the land into two states. One side accepted the plan, the other rejected it, and war followed. The consequences of those 67 words have been unfolding ever since, through war after war, right down to our own time. So it is worth being disciplined here about what the evidence really supports, because this is a topic where people love to reach for simple villains. The honest picture is this. The Declaration grew out of a genuine convergence, financial desperation, cold strategic calculation, and real ideological conviction among some British leaders who sincerely believed in the Zionist project for their own reasons. The financial pressures were absolutely real and well documented. Britain's national debt grew more than tenfold over the course of the war. The massive overdraft with Morgan was real. Wilson's credit squeeze was real. The Rothschild family's long financial entanglement with the British state is documented in their own archives. All of that is solid ground. What the evidence does not support is the crude conspiracy theory, the idea that one family secretly orchestrated the whole affair to serve its own interests. That story is not just unproven, it is false, and it belongs to a tradition of thinking about Jewish power that has caused immense harm. The truth is that the Declaration was the product of many people and many motives. It was shaped by Weizmann's chemistry and his relentless personal advocacy. It was shaped by Lloyd George's mixture of religious sentiment and hard political pragmatism. It was shaped by Balfour's own complicated views, which included real philosophical sympathy for the Zionist cause, and, it has to be said, a strain of the antisemitism common among British elites of the time, which saw resettling European Jews elsewhere as a convenient answer to what they coldly called a problem. It was shaped by the overwhelming strategic importance of the Suez Canal and the wish for a friendly presence in Palestine that could help guard Britain's route to India. And yes, it was shaped by money, by the simple fact that Britain was broke, and that the financial networks connecting London and New York and the wider war effort were all straining under the same load. But notice that the strategic logic and the financial logic point in the same direction, back to that canal. The Suez Canal cut the journey from Britain to India from weeks down to days, and whoever held it held the artery of the entire empire. Palestine sat right beside that artery. A friendly presence there would act as a kind of buffer, a protective zone shielding Britain's most vital trade route. This was not charity dressed up as principle, it was imperial infrastructure planning dressed up in the language of moral purpose. The Balfour Declaration was not a pure banking deal, but it was not a pure moral statement either. It was something more complicated and far more consequential than either. It was an empire in crisis, making promises it could not keep, with money it did not have, about land it did not own, to peoples whose interests could not all be satisfied at once. And the ones who paid the highest price for those contradictions were the ones who were never invited to the table at all. When the war finally ended, the true scale of Britain's reckoning came into view. Its debt had multiplied many times over. It owed enormous sums to the United States, debts that would take decades to work off, and that permanently shifted the balance of power between the two nations. Before the war, London had been the undisputed financial capital of the world. After the war, New York began its long climb to the top, and it never gave the position back. The pound weakened, the old certainties wobbled, and the British Empire, though it would linger on the map for decades more, had entered a slow decline it would never reverse, and the mandate for Palestine became one of the most expensive and ungovernable burdens Britain carried. Administering a land torn between two populations, both of whom felt betrayed, drained money and patience and political will. There were Arab revolts that forced Britain to pour in tens of thousands of troops. There were Jewish paramilitary groups, some of whose members had first been armed and trained by the British during the war, who eventually turned their weapons on the British administration itself. By the time Britain finally pulled out in 1948, it had spent a fortune trying to manage a crisis of its own making, a crisis that traced straight back to those contradictory promises. The Rothschild family, for its part, continued to support Jewish settlement well after the Declaration, through the Mandate years and into the founding of the State of Israel. One member of the family even left funds, on his death, to build the Israeli parliament building. But the point of the story is not to make that family the secret author of history. The point is that the financial threads of this story cannot be pulled apart from the human ones. Every loan, every bond issue, every land purchase, every desperate promise made in a frightened moment, all of it had consequences measured not in pounds but in human lives. The Arab families displaced to make room for new settlements, the Jewish refugees fleeing slaughter in Europe, seeking safety in a land that was already home to others, the soldiers of every side who fought and died in wars that were, at bottom, about territory and power, and who controlled the artery of empire. And the pattern set here did not stop in 1917. Great powers making promises about other people's land, for financial and strategic reasons, drawing borders on maps for populations they never consulted, that pattern repeated itself again and again. It ran through the artificial frontiers that created Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, borders that have generated conflict ever since. It ran through the oil concessions of the following decades, when Western companies carved up the region's petroleum with the same casual disregard for the people who lived above it. It ran through the Cold War, when two superpowers treated the whole region as a chessboard. The Balfour Declaration was not a strange one-off. It was a template for how financial pressure, imperial ambition, and strategic fear could combine to reshape the lives of millions of people who never got a seat at the table. So the next time you look at a map of the Middle East and wonder why the borders seem so arbitrary, why the conflicts feel so impossible to solve, why the grievances run so deep, remember this. Many of those lines were drawn not by the people who live inside them, but by empires trying to pay off their debts. Remember that one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century was addressed not to a king or a president or a general, but to a banker. And remember that those 67 words were not written in the confident hand of a mighty empire. They were written by one that was running out of money, running out of time, and willing to promise almost anything to almost anyone who could help it survive one more year. The debts of empires always get paid in the end. The only real question, the question this whole story forces us to face, is who ends up paying them? And it is almost never the ones who ran up the bill. If this changed the way you see the forces that shape our world, consider subscribing, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into here. The money, the power, and the quiet deals behind the headlines that most people never hear about. If you made it this far, leave a like so more people find it, and I will see you in the next one.